Imagine this. You're sitting on a plane, ready to take off, when suddenly a flight attendant's voice cuts through the cabin like a knife. It's sharp, it's loud, and it's directed at a young black girl who's just trying to find her seat. The tension is immediate. Passengers turn their heads, some whispering, others staring. The flight attendant's tone is harsh, her words dripping with impatience. "Excuse me, you need to move. This isn't your seat. Go to the back where you belong." The girl, no older than 16, freezes. Her face flushes with embarrassment, but before she can respond, the flight attendant doubles down. "I don't have time for this. Move, now." But here's the thing, this isn't just any girl. Unbeknownst to the flight attendant, this young woman is the daughter of the man who owns the entire airline. Yes, the owner, the man whose name is printed on the side of the plane, whose decisions shape the fate of every employee working for the company. And as the flight attendant continues to berate her, the girl's father watches silently from a few rows back, his expression unreadable. What happens next? Well, let's just say this flight attendant is about to learn a lesson she'll never forget. This story isn't just about a seat assignment gone wrong. It's about power, privilege, and the way people treat others when they think no one is watching. It's about assumptions, how we judge people based on appearances only to be proven completely wrong. And it's about karma, that sweet, undeniable force that has a way of setting things right when they go off the rails. Our main characters are easy to spot. There's the flight attendant, a woman who's clearly had a long day and is taking it out on the wrong person. She's used to being in control, used to passengers following her orders without question, but today she's about to meet her match. Then there's the young girl, poised and polite, but with a quiet strength that hints at the upbringing she's had. She's not the type to make a scene, but she's also not the type to let someone walk all over her. And finally, there's her father, a man of immense influence who's about to show the world what happens when you mess with his family. As the plane taxis down the runway, the tension in the cabin is palpable. The flight attendant has no idea what's coming. She's too focused on maintaining order, too convinced that she's in the right. But the other passengers, they're starting to notice something's off. The way the girl holds herself, the way her father watches the scene unfold with a calm intensity, it's clear this isn't going to end well for the flight attendant. And then, just as the plane levels off at cruising altitude, the girl stands up. She walks to the front of the cabin, her steps steady and deliberate. The flight attendant opens her mouth to stop her, but before she can say a word, the girl turns and says something that leaves everyone stunned. The flight attendant's face goes pale, the passengers gasp, and the girl's father, he finally speaks, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. But I'll stop there because what happens next is too good to spoil. Let's just say this flight attendant is about to have the most humbling moment of her career. And as for the girl, she's about to prove that sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones you should never underestimate. So, what do you think happens next? How does the flight attendant react when she realizes who she's been yelling at? And what does the girl's father do to make sure this never happens again? Stick around, because this story is just getting started. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The girl, whose name is Amara, had always been taught to carry herself with grace, no matter the situation. Her father, Elijah Carter, was a self-made billionaire who had built his airline empire from the ground up. He'd started as a baggage handler, working long hours and saving every penny until he could buy his first small plane. Over the years, he'd turned that single plane into a fleet, and his company, Sky Horizon Airlines, had become one of the most respected names in the industry. But despite his success, Elijah had never forgotten his roots. He'd raised Amara to be humble, kind, and to treat everyone with respect, lessons that were clearly lost on the flight attendant currently glaring at her. Amara had been looking forward to this flight. She and her father were heading to New York for a weekend getaway, just the two of them. It was rare for Elijah to take time off, and Amara had been excited to spend some quality time with him. They'd boarded the plane early, with Elijah opting to sit a few rows behind Amara to give her a sense of independence. He'd always believed in letting her navigate the world on her own, even if it meant stepping back and watching from a distance. But this time, his decision to stay in the background was about to have consequences he hadn't anticipated. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Linda, had been having a rough day. Her morning had started with a delayed commute, followed by a chaotic pre-flight briefing. By the time passengers began boarding, she was already on edge. Once she saw Amara, a young black girl in a hoodie and jeans, sitting in one of the premium seats. Linda's assumptions kicked in. She didn't bother to check the passenger manifest or ask any questions. Instead, she jumped to conclusions, convinced that Amara had wandered into the wrong section. "This is first class," Linda had snapped, her voice carrying across the cabin. "You need to go to the back where your seat is," Amara had tried to explain. "I think there's been a mistake. My ticket says—" But Linda cut her off. "I don't have time for this. Move now!" The words were sharp and the tone was even sharper. Amara felt her cheeks burn as passengers turned to watch. She glanced toward the back of the plane where her father sat. Elijah's expression was calm, but his eyes were locked on Linda, watching every move. He didn't intervene. Not yet. He wanted to see how Amara would handle the situation. It was a test, one he hoped she'd pass with the same poise he'd always admired in her. But as the plane took off and the tension in the cabin grew, Amara decided she'd had enough. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. Linda, who was preparing the beverage cart, looked up in surprise. "Sit down!" she barked, her voice tinged with irritation. But Amara ignored her. She walked to the front of the cabin, her head held high, and stopped near the cockpit door. Then she turned to face Linda, her voice steady but firm. "My name is Amara Carter," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And my father owns this airline." The cabin fell silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as passengers exchanged shocked glances. Linda froze, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her mind raced, trying to process what she'd just heard. Carter. The name was everywhere. On the side of the plane, on the uniforms, on the tickets. How could she have missed it? She'd been so quick to judge, so sure of herself, that she hadn't even bothered to check the passenger list. And now she was standing face to face with the daughter of the man who signed her paychecks. Elijah chose that moment to make his presence known. He stood up, his tall frame commanding attention as he walked toward the front of the plane. The passengers watched in awe, some whispering to each other, others pulling out their phones to record the scene. Elijah stopped beside Amara, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. His expression was calm, but there was a steeliness in his eyes that made Linda's stomach churn. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Linda stammered, her confidence crumbling under Elijah's gaze. I didn't realize," she began, but Elijah held up a hand to stop her. "What's your name?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. His eyes flicked to her name tag, then back to her face. "Linda," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elijah nodded slowly, as if filing the information away for later. "Linda," he repeated. "Do you treat all passengers this way, or just the ones you assume don't belong in first class?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Linda's mind raced, searching for a way to explain herself, but there was no excuse. She'd been caught in the act, and everyone on the plane knew it. The passengers were watching, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Some looked sympathetic, while others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. but no one spoke. The cabin was silent, waiting to see how Elijah would handle the situation. Amara, for her part, stood quietly beside her father. She'd said what she needed to say, and now it was up to him to decide what happened next. She trusted him to do the right thing, just as he'd always taught her to do. But even she couldn't predict what he had in mind. Elijah was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. And right now, all eyes were on him. As the plane continued its journey through the clouds, the tension in the cabin remained thick. Linda stood frozen, her hands clutching the edge of the beverage, cart as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Elijah's gaze never wavered, his expression unreadable. And Amara? She was calm, her quiet strength a testament to the values her father had instilled in her. But the story was far from over. What would Elijah do next? Would he fire Linda on the spot? Or would he give her a chance to redeem herself? And how would this incident affect the rest of the flight? The answers to those questions were still up in the air, literally. But one thing was certain, this was a moment Linda would never forget. And for the passengers on board, it was a reminder that you never know who someone really is, or what they're capable of, until you take the time to look beyond the surface. As the plane soared through the sky, the drama unfolding inside its cabin was far from over. And the next chapter of this story was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. As Elijah stood there, his hand still resting on Amara's shoulder, the weight of the moment settled over the cabin. Linda, the flight attendant, felt like the walls were closing in. Her mind raced with thoughts of what this could mean for her job, her career, her future. She had worked for Sky Horizon Airlines for over a decade, climbing her way up from part-time crew to a senior flight attendant position. She'd always prided herself on her professionalism, but now, in front of everyone, that reputation was crumbling. Her heart pounded as she tried to find the right words, but nothing came out. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their whispers like tiny needles pricking at her confidence. Elijah, however, wasn't in a rush. He was a man who believed in letting moments breathe, in allowing people to sit with their mistakes. He glanced at Amara, giving her a subtle nod of approval. She had handled herself with the kind of grace he had always hoped to see in her. But now it was his turn to step in. He turned back to Linda, his voice calm but firm. "Linda, I think we need to have a conversation. But not here. Let's step into the galley." The words sent a chill down Linda's spine. The galley, the small, confined space at the back of the plane, felt like a courtroom, and she was about to stand trial. She nodded silently, her legs feeling like lead, as she followed Elijah and Amara down the aisle. The passengers watched them go, their curiosity piqued. Some leaned into the aisles to catch a glimpse, while others exchanged knowing looks. This wasn't just a confrontation between a flight attendant and a passenger. This was a moment that would ripple through the entire airline. In the galley, the hum of the plane's engines was louder, the space cramped and cluttered with carts and supplies. Elijah leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, while Amara stood beside him, her expression calm but resolute. Linda stood awkwardly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her uniform. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling, I don't know what to say. I made a mistake. I didn't realize—" Elijah held up a hand, cutting her off. "Linda, this isn't just about a mistake. This is about how you treated my daughter. This is about the assumptions you made based on how she looks. Do you understand why that's a problem?" Linda nodded, her eyes downcast. "Yes, sir. I do. I let my stress get the better of me, and I took it out on her. It was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Elijah studied her for a moment, his gaze piercing. He wasn't just looking at Linda, he was seeing the bigger picture. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue, one that went beyond one flight attendant's bad day. He thought about the countless other passengers who might have been treated unfairly, who might have been judged or dismissed because of how they looked or where they came from. This was about more than just Amara. It was about the culture of his company, the values it stood for. "Linda," he said finally, "I'm going to give you a chance to make this right. But it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to prove to me and to everyone on this plane that you're capable of change. Do you think you can do that?" Linda looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "Yes, sir. I'll do whatever it takes." Elijah nodded, but before he could say more, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting everyone in the galley. The overhead compartments rattled, and a few items fell from the shelves. Linda instinctively reached out to steady Amara, who had stumbled slightly. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Linda saw something in Amara's expression, not anger or resentment, but something softer, almost like understanding. It was a small moment, but it lingered, adding another layer to the tension in the air. As the turbulence subsided, Elijah straightened up. "We'll continue this conversation later," he said. "For now, I want you to go back out there and do your job. But remember, Linda, every passenger on this plane deserves respect. No exceptions." Linda nodded, her throat tight. She turned and walked back into the cabin, her steps slow and deliberate. The passengers watched her return, their eyes following her every move. Some looked sympathetic while others seemed skeptical. Linda forced a smile as she resumed her duties, but her hands were shaking as she poured drinks and handed out snacks. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Would she be able to redeem herself? Or was this the beginning of the end for her career? Meanwhile, Amara returned to her seat, her mind racing. She had always known her father was a powerful man, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. She felt a mix of pride and unease, pride in how he had handled the situation, but unease about what it all meant. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something she couldn't quite put into words. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by, and wondered what the rest of the flight would bring. Back in his seat, Elijah leaned back, his thoughts equally complex. He knew this incident wasn't over. It was just the beginning. He would have to address this on a larger scale to ensure that Sky Horizon Airlines lived up to the values he had always believed in. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin still palpable, the story far from resolved, and as the flight carried on, the passengers couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would Linda rise to the challenge? Would Elijah's actions lead to real change? And what about Amara? How would this experience shape her moving forward? The answers were still up in the air, just like the plane itself, soaring through the sky with no clear destination in sight. The only thing certain was that this was a flight no one would ever forget.